Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first session of the day. This will be, I think, a little bit of a scrambled egg because we have changed a couple of the roles here. I'm going to be moderating. My friend Josh is going to be on the panel. And because I just got this assignment recently, I'm going to probably read some of my notes here rather than do this extemporaneously. We're going to be talking about middle powers today, and I don't think we would have been talking about middle powers even a couple of years ago. But there have been some major tectonic shifts in geopolitics. Certainly there have been with the United States, where I'm from, and some of that was evident, I think, in the recent foreign policy document that President Trump and his team presented. The headline in the New York Times was that the United States is basically disengaging from its role as a leader in Western Europe. That opens the way for others to fill that vacuum, chiefly middle powers, which is builders. We're going to, I'm going to introduce the people on the panel, and we're going to basically task them with a couple of questions. We only have 45 minutes, and I'd like to leave a little bit of time at the end for Q&A as well. So hopefully we'll have 5 minutes or 7 minutes at the end for a couple of questions. To my immediate left, Zhandos Shaimardanov is the director of Kazakhstan's Institute for Strategic Studies, which is the Kazakhstan's premier policy research institution. And Kazis, as it's known in Astana, contributes to Kazakhstan's role as an emerging middle power in Eurasia, with a growing reputation for its multi-vector foreign policy. To Zhandos's left is Thomas Greminger. He's the executive director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He's a respected Swiss diplomat with extensive experience in comparative security, conflict prevention, and multilateral diplomacy. He's a former Secretary General of the OSCE and worked to sustain dialogue among 57 states during a period of heightened geopolitical tension. Josh Lincoln, to Thomas's left, is a senior fellow at the Tufts School in the Fletcher School at Tufts in Boston. And he is also a former UN representative. He worked with Ban Ki-moon for approximately 13 or 14 years. So he has a lot of experience with multilateral diplomacy. So our first question today let's start by observing that middle powers have to have enough strategic autonomy to navigate between larger blocs. How do they do this? How do they balance relationships with major powers and neighbors while still advancing their own national agendas and promoting regional stability? I'd like to just address that to the three of you one at a time. If you could just give us a brief answer on that one. Zhandos.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of Doha Forum for the invitation to participate in this session. And I'm very pleased to be among such distinguished speakers. And I believe that Kazakhstan's experience will be useful in the context of today's session, as we are in many ways new middle power and not because of our size or military strength, but because of the principles on which Kazakhstan has built its foreign policy within the last 3 decades. Our emergence as a middle power is based on a simple formula: predictability, balance, and respect for international law. And based on these 3 principles, we earned trust, but also we operate confidently in a very complex geopolitical neighborhood. For us, autonomy is not about choosing a side. It's about diversifying our strategic partnerships. And you know that we have, within the last 3 decades, we have established very strong relations and partnerships with the United States, with China, Russia, the European Union, of course, with the Gulf countries, and many, many others. And not because of we are uncertain, but because every partnership strengthens different dimension of our development. And in this context, the platforms such as the Doha Forum are critically important for middle powers. You know that in recent years, for Central Asia, the new C5+1 format, not the new, but the C5+1 format has become very active and very important for our future development. Just within the recent 12 months, there were meetings on the presidential level on the C5+1 format with European Union, United States, China, Russia, this month with Japan, then South Korea. And these formats helps us to share and shape the agenda, not just to respond to it. And given this, Kazakhstan, in a few years ago, also launched its own Astana International Forum platform. It helps us, again, to share our vision, to shape it, and also this is how I believe the middle powers can contribute to the international order. We cannot impose the solutions, but we can keep the dialogue open, and we can create such neutral platforms where we can offer the practical solutions when the great powers have the overlapping interests. And this is, in my view, the way how middle powers can contribute for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhandos. Just a quick question. Is it mostly a matter of soft power that you feel that the middle powers can contribute?
Soft power, but also there are many different instruments, like diplomacy, like also infrastructure. We also invest in infrastructure, in connectivity, I would say. You know, the importance of the middle corridor has raised in recent years. And for us, it's not just a transport corridor. It's a true economic corridor which opens the opportunities for trade, for diplomacy, for the future development of our region. Because we invest not only in the hard infrastructure, but also into the stability of our region. Because when every country across this route invests into the corridor, they also share the risks, but also the prosperity of the whole region. Thank you.
Economic and soft power both. Thomas, how do you see the role of middle powers now?
Well, so if we assume that autonomy, strategic autonomy, and agency are key features of middle powers, then obviously balancing relations with major powers, great powers, is absolutely crucial. And this is, in current times, not a trivial endeavor. Clearly, you have a great power that is currently trying to change borders by military force. You have a great power that is conducting aggressive, unpredictable, mercantilistic trade policies. You have a great power that is conducting a more aggressive foreign policy. And in the mix of these great powers, balancing the relations is, I think, a challenge. Now, I think as a middle power, you can be part of an alliance, but it cannot be an exclusive relationship. You cannot be fully dependent. You cannot bandwagon. You may have your co-allies, but you would join coalitions depending on specific interests. And I think this is what you often refer to as flexilateralism, or you call it multi-alignment. So basically, multilateralism at different configurations depending on your interest. Now, having relations with different major powers in a polarized and fragmented world is clearly a major asset, and it allows you to be a bridge builder, it allows you to be a coalition builder, it allows you to be a peace broker. I think we'll come back to these things in a moment. I think since there is this trend of great powers exerting regional hegemony, many countries, I would say more countries, will feel like middle powers in today's world, and will try to navigate their way between Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians, adopting, what we often refer to as a multi-vector foreign policy. Let me perhaps, point to a risk that comes about, this notion of middle powers, and that is to conduct, if you are multi-vector, if you try to balance relations with great powers, that you then turn completely transactional, completely opportunistic in your foreign policy. And I think, and you also see middle powers, that have a self-image of middle powers, that have partly militaristic, aggressive, and interventionist foreign policies. And I think that is not compatible with this notion of middle power as a benign actor in the international scene. So what I'm trying to say here is, I think there needs predictability, there needs to be reliability, and you need to stick to certain principles. And these principles need to remain the same while your engagement, your foreign policy engagement, may vary. And I think that is for me a kind of a caveat or important call to countries, that consider themselves to be a middle power.
Thomas, you've alluded to this in terms of the foreign policy aspect, but I'm interested to know if you see the role of middle powers chiefly as peacemakers, as mediators, as bridge builders, or are they, in fact, as Zhandos was describing, economic bridge builders at the same time? Are they peacemakers? Can they be?
I think they can, and you have, I think, important examples out there of countries that have a self-image as a middle power that indeed engage in peace building. But yeah, I would say, I said before, they can be coalition builders, and that would also apply in a multilateral setting. I think, if you want to reform today's multilateral system, you will need also middle powers. Again, perhaps, at some point we want to come back to the definition of middle powers, because we may find other categories of countries that wouldn't have a self-image of middle power, but would pursue very, very similar foreign policy objectives. And I particularly think of small states. You know, had Minister Esmenaide been here, I would have asked him, you know, does Norway consider itself to be a middle power? Switzerland does not. Switzerland considers itself to be a small state. And I think I see a number of states that would have very similar foreign policy principles as middle powers, but would consider themselves to be small states. Now, if we talk about peacemaking, if we talk about reforming multilateral organizations, and if we, you know, think of potential coalitions, alliances that could boost these processes, I think it's quite important, you know, that we perhaps, you know, think a bit flexibly about terminologies.
Josh, I'd like to ask you to draw upon your experience at the United Nations a little bit here, and how do you see the role of middle powers based upon your experience with the biggest multilateral institution?
Thank you, Charles. Sabah al-khair. Thank you to the Doha Forum. Thank you to the people in the government of Qatar for their hospitality. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I think you've already heard some of the very different perspectives that have come up just the first 5 minutes between the examples of Switzerland and Kazakhstan. And obviously the main difficulty is we don't have a definition for middle powers. And typically in the literature, in IR theory, great powers and small powers have gotten a lot more attention than the muddling, meddling middle, as it were. And so one is tempted to start from a point of skepticism and say, there's nothing new here. These are just a group of countries pursuing national interest in slightly different ways today based on circumstance. And I think that's a fair place to start, and perhaps a healthy place to start. But I have to say, in the last year or two, I'm beginning to think that there's something much more interesting here. Do not expect it to make the headlines. It would not have made the first day of the Doha Forum. It is not a sort of a sharp, newsworthy event. But if we're beginning to look at the ways in which things are shifting, this is an interesting one. And I would suggest to you that in the coming years, we're going to see more of it, although it's not going to be clear for a while. Part of the challenge we face is that we all bring our existing theologies or philosophies to it. We divide up the countries based on north, south, developing, developed, colonial, post-colonial, regional groupings, and so on. So we would never put Argentina and the UAE and Indonesia and South Africa conceptually into the same group. But if we were able to set some of those labels aside, if we could just undo the programming in our head and sort of look at, let's say, the top 25, top 30 countries, and say, what role do these countries play, and are they playing? And to your question, Charles, in terms of, I did this by going back and looking at the roles that this group of countries, and we could be endlessly flexible about how we define the bottom of the list. What roles do they play? How often have they been members of the Security Council? How often have they hosted a COP? How often are they conveners or co-conveners of special subgroups? Are they members of the Human Rights Council? Have they led coalitions? Have they been lead peacekeeping contributors? You could go on and on and on and take every single significant indicator of engagement at the global level, and you would find that this group of 25 countries, in fact, constitute the workhorse of the workhorses of the system. I think it's that we haven't seen them as such because our attention has been focused elsewhere. Current circumstances make it much more acute, and now we're beginning to pay attention. But it's the interesting sort of evolution of, we used to have a policeman, you know, a neighborhood policeman. Are we gradually moving to a system of the Neighborhood Watch Association instead, where a fair amount of the work is done by groups, by coalitions, by pairings, flexibly, and where the main obstacle is really still in our own heads. We still can't quite figure out, but if you actually look at it, you can go, who led the, you know, sort of, who co-facilitated, for example, the Pact for the Future? You know, what were the different subgroupings? Which are the countries that lead these different areas? You can every time find middle powers, loosely defined, in that group, leading that work, sort of trying to contribute in a way that they can. Do they derive a national advantage from this? Clearly so. I wonder, the MAGA hats. We might be able to create two sets of hats. There's the make, and then put your country name in there, make Norway great again, or there might be another set of countries where you just delete the again and you say make Norway great, and perhaps there are two sets. But okay, that's not a particularly insightful thing to say. It's far more interesting that they find it compelling and interesting and a prerogative of their new status, or of their status to contribute to international processes in different ways.
I'd like to pick up on that and talk about how middle powers either combine with one another or go their own way and chart their own course. For example, Zhandos, there was most recently the C5+1 meeting in Washington, where Kazakhstan was bound together with neighboring countries for important multilateral meetings. There's obviously the BRICS group, another important association of, in many cases, middle powers. So do middle powers benefit from associating with one another politically and economically, and if so, how?
Of course, they benefit from sharing their experiences, and most importantly is the knowledge, because our countries, we see that being a middle power, we also are upper middle income country, and we are approaching the status of high income country, and we have some good progress. You mean in economic terms, but also in terms of the soft power. We have such kind of a responsibility for the development of the region, because we are not developing in isolation, and we want every country in our region to be developing as inclusively, and that's why we want to push further this integration and co-development of other middle powers. And such format as C5+1 you mentioned is very important for us, because it raises the voice of Kazakhstan, or Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, or Kyrgyzstan is not visible on its own, but as we come in a cooperation, we have more voices, a collective voice, and it gives us even more power and responsibility as well. And I would like to emphasize the role of middle powers in terms of sharing this knowledge and experience, because as middle powers we have reached some level, and we need and have to share it with some other small countries. When we share this experience, we have also the responsibility, and I think it provides more incentives and for further development, because we need to develop the inclusivity in our region and within the country. And given this format, I think that's how we want to develop the Astana International Forum for the future, where we provide some reports. We recently had the Astana Think Tank Forum, where we provided the joint reports with other think tanks from not only the region but outside. And you know that we face very similar challenges: how to diversify our economies, how to tackle the issues with the climate change, with green transition. And we cannot solve these problems on our own. We need the cooperation within the region, but also we need the involvement of other participants, also including the great powers. That's how we want to provide this inclusivity and also solve some regional but also the global challenges of, on the international level.
Thomas, is this a question of making a virtue of necessity for middle powers? They don't have the economic clout or the military clout of the great powers. So are they finding a role for themselves that that is exclusively theirs because they really have no choice?
I think, the more pressure is exerted by great powers on other states to join their camp, to choose clearly sides, I think the more you will trigger interests among those states, to join their forces, to cooperate on their own, because it's not in their interest, to bandwagon and to join a camp and then be entangled, in the policies of a great power. And I think this is why, on the one hand, you see, which is an interesting perspective from the point of view of a neutral country, you see neutrals in the political West under pressure, but globally speaking, you see more multi-aligned countries popping up, and because there is this sense, why should I be forced to join a side? That's not in my interest, and I think this hopefully would, in the medium to longer term, also lead to more cooperation, to more joining forces. Right now, what we are seeing is rather attempts by great powers to draw these middle powers into their camp. And frankly speaking, when I look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS, these are, I think the jury is still out, but for the time being, the sense that I'm getting is these are more attempts, to draw some of these middle powers into, be it the political Western camp, when we think about the G7, and when we think about the SEO BRICS, into what has recently been called the political Eastern camp. And I think that's not in the interest of middle powers. That's not in the interest of small states. I think we need to find formats that are aligned with the interests of middle powers. There have been, and I think the C5+1 is, if it exploits its potential to the fullest, it could become an interesting experiment in that sense. I mean, I think we would agree it's far from fully exploiting its potential yet, but there is an enormous potential. I have, we have seen in the history of European security, we have seen coalitions, as for instance, what was 50 years ago in the Helsinki process called the N+N, the neutrals and the non-aligned. They were the driving forces. They were those mediating between the two great powers back then. And they played a decisive role in shaping a cooperative security order in Europe. And we may soon need again such forces if we want to overcome the current deep confrontation in European security order.
Josh, give some advice to middle powers based on your experience in terms of whether they should combine and as Zhandos was saying, multiply their effectiveness by doing that, or whether they should look after their own interests and go it alone. What advice do you have?
Well, all right, I would never give advice to middle powers, but I wanted to just start. I was for some reason I was raised in a three-child family, and I was thinking about the burden of the middle child. You have to manage your older brother, and yet you have to bring along your younger siblings as well. And I thought this is sort of the perpetual tension coming before a middle power. You have to manage your great neighbors, the superpowers who themselves believe that they They can go without you sometimes, and you have to bring others along. And I think this is one of the parts that is less discussed, which is within a particular region, there may be suspicion, there may be mistrust, even around a regional power from the other states in that region. And so the work of creating trust would be the first point of that advice that I would say. I think it's easy enough to pursue your national interest and to just say, look, this middle power thing gives us an opportunity to increase our profile, to get what's ours. You hear this terminology coming. I think the real question is going to be whether that is then transformed into some notion of, I don't want to call it custodianship, but of shared responsibility. And I think middle powers could, if they wanted to, and they will feel it. They do clearly feel it, this responsibility, in different ways. We could compare cases, but I think that is going to be the determining thing. Is this just a means of me getting mine, or is it the path to sort of a form of custodianship or an awareness of a responsibility that perhaps you didn't have to exercise previously, but now that things are more chaotic above, that responsibility has become more acute. And I think we're seeing that quiet internal conversation beginning to happen. I was thinking that maybe an added definitional element for first is even superpowers need friends, notwithstanding national security documents recently issued. Everybody needs friends, even superpowers. And I think a definitional element we might add to middle power is the middle power is that power that knows that it needs the international system to succeed and to thrive. And that is the difference between the two. And so I think we're bound to see more of it. I think we'll see it more at regional levels. We'll see it more at international levels. This is what I was pointing to earlier. If you were to sit down today and do an analysis of all of the roles filled by middle powers within the existing multilateral system at regional level, at global level, you would find an extraordinarily compelling list of the working activities of middle powers day in and day out. I think it's just that we haven't thought about it as a distinctive category, as a distinctive form of motion in the system. Thomas just gave the example of 50 years ago and the role that was played at a moment of similarly high tension, by the way, I think quite interestingly, right? And there have been calls for a similar process now. People saying, look, we need another such process at this time, but we don't yet have the countries able to carry it out, or they have not yet accepted that this is a moment in which they can begin that kind of a conversation.
Let's follow up on that. And I can go to you on this, Thomas, but the circumstances right now are somewhat dire in terms of the geopolitical environment is very tense. Is that an opportunity here for middle powers to step up and assert themselves? And if so, how are they going to do that? Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think I was, trying to underline this point of middle powers really having a vested interest in an international system that is predictable, that is fair, and that is based on commonly agreed rules. I think that is really a vested interest. And yeah, I think, there is this saying that, every crisis is also an opportunity, and I think we have no other choice than to at least seriously try to seize the opportunities. And I think there are some opportunities out there when I look, to managing a conflict. We have now been talking a lot about Gaza these days. There is also, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, there is at least right now some sort of a structured negotiation process. And I think, so there are some opportunities out there. But, even if these processes succeed, you will then need institutions, solid institutions that kind of consolidate the gains of let's say, a settlement in Ukraine. And I think for this, you will need a set of actors that help develop, reform multilateral institutions. And I think here there is a huge window of opportunity for middle powers. Middle powers writ large again. I think I would put also states that see themselves as small states. I would also put them into that category. I think generally those countries that have an interest in a reliable, predictable, rule-based international system.
Zhandos, I wonder if you can talk specifically about Kazakhstan's role here, because Kazakhstan, of course, shares a large border with Russia, a smaller but significant border with China. So Kazakhstan has the opportunity, it seems, to be a mediator and to take more aggressive or positive steps as a bridge builder. What's Kazakhstan doing in that regard, and what should it be doing?
Well, you're absolutely right. We are in the middle of big powers such as Russia, China, and but we also consider it not as a challenge, but also as an opportunity for us, starting from the trade corridor, which I was also talking about, because given this global rivalry and the new geopolitical environment, there is still trade, and it will be done, and we create these neutral corridors for trade, for food security. This is one of the roles of Kazakhstan and the middle powers, but also we try to provide the platforms for peacemaking, and we see that these conflicts will sooner or later end up. And the big powers, they need some neutral platforms to openly discuss these issues and how to resolve these problems for the future. And I believe Kazakhstan, and specifically Astana, can provide such a platform. We see the visits of many different big leaders from Europe, from China, who visited Kazakhstan, from Russia, and we hope that in maybe next year, the leader of the United States may visit our region as well. So Kazakhstan is ready to provide the platform for the dialogue between these great powers, starting from the geopolitical issues, but also for the other issues in environment, in climate issues. Next year there will be a regional ecological summit in Astana in April, where we will discuss such very relevant issues for our region, but it will be with the partnership of the United Nations. So we are ready to provide the platform for discussion, for the dialogue, and it gives us an opportunity to establish not a vertical dialogue, but a horizontal one with big powers.
Thank you. We have about 7 minutes left, so if we could take a couple questions here, I would direct them to either specific individuals or to the panel in general. Yes. Microphone on the way. And please identify yourself.
I'm Sandeep Waslekar with a think tank called Strategic Foresight Group. This is all of my friends. Anyway, so my question is, considering that there have been very successful coalitions which have made real change in the world, like Landmine Mine Treaty and so many other, which were built by the coalitions which were not big powers, but several other countries coming together. And today's environment of dire political situation, is there a scope for middle powers, small powers, and others, except the very big powers, to come together in thematic coalitions to pursue specific objectives, whether it is disarmament, whether it is limiting the arms race, whether it is limiting the AI arms race, at least to be a voice of reason, if not a force of change?
Josh.
I'll take a first. Actually, that was my next point, which I take the example of the G20 conceptually, and I think to myself, what if we need a G20 for G20 is just based on GDP. It's not particularly helpful, but the notion of a group of 20 in specific areas, Security Council reform. If one were to put the 5 permanent members on one side, how long would the discussion last if you put the next 20 or 25 on the other side of that conversation? Truthfully, I think we have to, climate finance. What's the G20 of climate finance? It's already there in some respects. It's evolving, it's happening. So we've begun to see this. I think interest-based coalitions, issue-specific, because the alignments will change. On one issue, a particular country will want to be involved. It may not be interested on another issue. It's not a priority. It's not a national priority. It's not a regional priority. That's fine. It doesn't matter so much. But if one were to begin to conceptualize these coalitions on specific issues, and this is where I think the skepticism is fair, we have not really seen that yet at scale. And the question, I think the real question is going to be, if we come back here 2 or 3 years from today, will we be able to report a considerable amount of activity in such issue-specific coalitions on different topics?
If I may, I mean, Sandip, the example that you refer to is indeed, I think, a very successful issue-specific coalition. It was the Human Security Network that was the driving force behind the Ottawa Convention, behind work on child soldiers, behind creating the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and so I think, yeah, why not imagine again something similar today? What was the ingredients back then? I think it was a commitment to a cause or to a number of causes. But it was also political leadership. You had a set of political leaders, that took it up, and once these leaders were gone, unfortunately, also the Human Security Network lost power. I'm currently hosting at my center a coalition that is entitled Coalition Article 109. Article 109, you may know, is the article in the UN Charter that foresees a review conference to revise the Charter. And so this is an attempt that seems to have a lot of political traction right now to collect the necessary majority of UN member states to launch a process towards reviewing the Charter. This, seems extremely visionary, daring these days, and it is not going to happen tomorrow, but perhaps after tomorrow. So I think it makes sense, to see, is there a coalition of states out there that is willing to join a coalition in that direction?
Zhandos.
Well, I think this question of thematic coalitions is very important. And there are some coalitions which could be led on international level, such as reducing poverty done by the World Bank, or some other, like climate change, by the UN institutions. But there are some issues which should be raised by the middle powers and some small powers, as you mentioned. For example, the technological race. What we see now is not only a change of the geopolitical context and environment, but also the new technological race, which started with this rapid adoption of AI instruments into our lives. And I believe that in the next decade, this AI race will have a big influence on our national sovereignty of all the nations. And that's why the Kazakhstan has invested a lot in physical infrastructure, into competencies of our citizens, in order to provide the possibilities for the development of these new instruments. And I think we can also provide this, again, the platform for our other nations. Because when the big powers compete within this technological race, we cannot compete with them. I mean the middle powers, the small powers, but we need to ensure the foundation which will enable our technological sovereignty for the future. And we need to focus on some 4 pillars. One of them is infrastructure, then the development of capabilities, our own models, and also the cooperation within the region. And that's how I think one of these thematic cooperations should be focused on technological development, because it will eventually reduce the gap between the big powers and small ones. Otherwise, this gap will rapidly increase in the next decades. Thank you.
I apologize that we have run out of time, so we don't have an opportunity to take any more questions, but I want to thank our panelists for giving us a sort of a broad overview of the role of middle powers. In Fukuyama's famous formulation at the end of the Cold War, that it was the end of history, it clearly is not the end of history. And the middle powers are taking a stand now to play a role in the different geopolitics that the environment that we're in right now. Thank you very much to the forum for this, and thank you to our panelists for their expert insights. Thank you.